Alrighty, so we're here again for another lecture. This week we're going to be talking about imperialism, colonialism, westernization, easternization, Americanization, and neoliberalism. So lots of different interwoven concepts here related to globalization. Um, so I'll just get into it. Obviously, you got the required readings and viewings this week. Actually, it's more like readings and listenings. You got this lecture recording, The Long-Term Impact of COVID with Carl Muth, which is a podcast, the neoliberal podcast. Um, while you're listening to that, think about the different ways that things have changed even throughout the pandemic. I know that that was completed in, I believe, early 2020. So just when the pandemic was getting started, it was not too far into where we're at now, at least. So if there's anything different from what is being talked about, or if there were predictions that were right, yeah, just think about the different ways that it's evolved over time for all of us. And then there's also another COVID related reading. Hopefully, you'll all get into that one. Um, the theory is pretty interesting that they discuss in that. So I'll let you all digest all of that. No worries if you don't get it right off the bat. Some things can be a little bit more tricky, especially with neoliberalism, because it's such a broad concept. So this isn't the first last time we're going to be talking about all of these. They'll come up later in the semester as well. So if you're ever not sure about anything, don't be too concerned. But so the aims of this lecture, to understand the key concepts that describe the processes and structures involved in historical and contemporary realities, exploring the relationships between these and the critiques made of them, exploring how these relate and overlapped with other processes and structures of globalization, exploring the roots and principles of the theory of neoliberalism and its importance to the development of globalization, considering the criticisms made of neoliberalism, examining theoretical alternatives that are put forward, and to reflect on the impact of recent global events and implications for the relationship between neoliberalism and globalization. So we'll get started off on the different isms and izations. And as I said, we're focusing on seven major concepts here. And since we're focusing on globalization, we also have to note the other processes that are affected in large parts of the world, both in the past and today. So to be able to get to the point that we're at here, we have to be able to understand what happened before. So starting off with imperialism, I'm sure most of you have heard that term before, but imperialism is a broad concept that describes the various methods employed by one country to gain control over another country and then to exercise that control, especially in political, economic, and military control over that specific country. And of course, the famous example of this is the British Empire. But imperialism has wide domains of control. And what's of more recent interest is the cultural imperialism and media imperialism, which is discussed later on in the semester in more detail. So, in short, cultural imperialism involves cultures imposing themselves more or less consciously on other cultures, and media imperialism involves the Western, especially the US media, and their technologies dominating less developed countries, nations, cultures, all of that. So, we'll get into more of that later on in the semester down the road. So, but imperialism as a term came from the Roman imperium, associated with domination and control over neighboring countries. And the term empire is derived from imperium, and that was used to describe the way that the Romans ruled. And that notion of the empire and imperialism is a process that came to be associated with ruling over very vast geographic spaces and the people that live there, which leads to the association between imperialism and globalization, obviously. So the term imperialism was used more widespread in the late 19th century as nations are competing for control over various undeveloped geographical regions, especially in Africa. And questions were raised about the need for political control by imperial powers and the longstanding rationale that the quote unquote superior cultures like imperial powers were necessary and better than the quote unquote inferior cultures, non imperial powers. So um, these have historical examples and contemporary examples, of course, and there are also forms of imperialism. So there's four different major types. We already talked about cultural imperialism really quickly, but the other forms are economic imperialism, political imperialism, and neo-imperialism. So political imperialism declined after World War II, as most imperial nations had withdrawn reluctantly from the nations that they controlled. So while there's a little less imperialism today in the forms of like conscientious political imperialism. There's many forms of imperialism that persist, like economic imperialism. So, for example, imperialism in the economic sense continues as the British East India Company exercised great economic power over India. The Hudson's Bay Company exercised great control over the fur trade, and later other commerce in North America and in the US. In the US, it's dominated the world economy throughout the later half of the 20th century. So these types of economic imperialism paved the way for capitalist industries and new markets for those industries. So the capitalistic economic system tends to expand imperialistically throughout the world. So when describing the economic factors that are the essence of imperialism, that Vladimir Lenin, who you probably have heard of in previous sociological theory courses, he argued that there are five factors that are inherent to capitalism, and that is the concentration of production and capital developed to such a high stage that it creates monopolies, which play decisive roles in economic life. The merging of bank capital with industrial capital and the creation on the basis of financial capital and of a financial oligarchy. The export of capital, which is important as distinguished from the export of commodities itself. So it's the export of capital, not commodities. The formation of international capitalist monopolies, which share the world amongst themselves, and the territorial division of the whole world among the greatest capitalistic powers. Um, so Lenin considered imperialism as something of a parasite. So it was a parasitic system, and that one part of it, and basically it reflects the decay of capitalism as a whole because it is eating itself. It's a parasite. It's eating at the rotten areas of capitalism. And so Lenin thought that the fact that capitalism is either in danger of collapse or that it's decayed is eventually proving that it's easy to discard it and that it's a system that we should not be using in essence. Um, and so there are other forms of imperialism, and especially within newer scholars' discussions of these, such as new imperialism or neo-imperialism. It's also been argued to have sort of come about. Um, One theorist that it talks about it in particular is Dave Harvey, and he calls it a capitalist imperialism. Sorry, let me just switch over. Um, so he sees it as a contradictory fusion of economics and politics, and these two concepts fused into one is what capitalist imperialism ends up becoming. And so, with the US as the primary representative of this concept, between the political and economic objectives, you see imperialism fluctuating back and forth, sometimes contradicting itself in ways just to achieve control over geographic, economical, or other nation states while leaving the other side of the objective in the dust. So, what Harvey's arguing then is that the new imperialism is the broad heading of capitalist imperialism. And Harvey sees capitalist imperialism as burdened by a series of internal and external contradictions, making it unstable. So, in essence, what you want to take from that is that there's still elements of control that are being placed over certain political or economic sections, whether that is geographically taking an entire country. Um, we'll get into that a little bit more in capitalism next week. Sorry, not next week, the week after. Um, but in that, just consider the ways that control is being held over other countries. You don't need to have absolutely everything about imperialism nailed down, but they'll make more sense as we get a little bit more into it. And there's also Ghosh, who talked about the new elements of imperialism. And so within the 21st century imperialism, it's less about direct control over land, which is what the British Empire was focused on, for example. And it's more exercised through global institutions like internal regulations and multilateral agreements. So imperialism continues to be shaped by the large capital controlling the economic territory of smaller capital, but it's much more subtle now. So it includes privatization of services like water, health, education, sanitation that were once administered by like local and national governments and are now being controlled by large corporations in more powerful countries. So Ghosh is less concerned with the US as a sole imperial power and instead is arguing that with the exception of China, the relative power of geopolitical regions within global capitalist imperialism is persisting. So In other words, the new imperialism largely maintains global inequalities and power relations, but it's through different means and less within the traditional imperialism that you would think of when you think of the British Empire and the colonies. So, but within that, we also get into colonialism. And so I'll let you read that over a little bit while I take a drink here. But I'm sure most of you know that colonization is the creation of the colonial power as a source of administration in the area. Um, and within that area, it's being colonized to run its internal affairs. So while imperialism gives a control without the creation of colonies, colonialism usually involves settlers and a more formal mechanism of control than imperialism. So colonization entails the colonizer creating an administrative apparatus to run internal affairs within the colonized country, which we have Canada. If you have Canada, for example, we're a colonized country. The indigenous peoples were here way before the colonizers who came into the country and set up shop and decided that they were going to create an administrative apparatus, the Canadian government, to run all of the internal affairs that are going on in the colonized country to the benefit of Britain, who sent everybody over, well, Britain and France. But regardless, while colonization is involving economic and political control, imperialism is more focused on the economic control, and that's it's more about political control when you're talking about colonization because it's supposed to be taking over the individual sections in the country, whereas when you're thinking about imperialism, it's more about the economics and behind it. So while colonialism has persisted despite discretion or direction of decolonization, which is the process of revealing and dismantling colonial power in all of its forms, including institutional and cultural forces that maintain colonial power even after the political independence has been achieved. We're still not at that point where decolonization is completely dismantled. There's still elements of decolonize or colonization, even if we've tried to decolonize. So obviously here's a map of different places that have been colonized and by who. So you can see on here, we've got the UK, there's France as well in Africa. Lots of Africa has been colonized by most of the countries that are in this geographical area, but there have been others like Spain um, that are not always considered when you think about colonial empires. Um, Most of the time, when we're thinking about Canada, we think about the UK. So that'll be a main focus, of course, if you're thinking about Canadian colonization. But on that, we also have decolonization, but there's also neocolonization, which is it was specific to more the period after World War II, where there was control over colonies and nation states, and it was becoming more subtle, such as controlling through cultural and educational institutions, focusing more on economic control, exploitation. And that's a lot harder to resist and combat because it's not as direct as colonization in its previous forms were. So, um, and there's also post-colonialism, which involves the developments that take place in a former colony after the colonizing powers depart. So there's very few colonies that remain in its original form, um, which that kind of insinuates that we're in a post-colonial world, and post-colonialism and is underway in most of the colonies. But there has been a lot of discussion in more recent years about various developments that occur after a former colony has departed, such as the national identity of those that are inhabiting the land after colonial power. So that's something that researchers and scholars have discussed about the overt and subtle negative stereotypes that have been developed in the West about those who lived in the East, including the difficulty of those who live in the East in developing a positive identity despite the negativity that's persisted about them in the West. And you can see that in negative stereotypes about um, Middle Eastern countries, especially when you're talking about religion. We have in the West a very negative view overall of Muslim countries, which is quite unfortunate. But that's persisting in part because of colonialism, where we have now said that these are not good uh, cultures and religions to have. They're not something that we want to uphold in our society. Obviously, Canada is getting to a closer point of not being horrible like that anymore. But those stereotypes are still existing, so we can't just ignore them. We can say that we're a multicultural and diverse country, but Canada is still upholding these racist and colonial ideals still today. So other post-colonial theorists also focus on literature when it points to cultural control over those who are considered Indigenous in whichever text they're examining. So for example, textbooks written by colonial powers will reflect the perspective of the colonial power, including its right to be in power, the superiority of the colonial power over the quote unquote inferiority of those who are native to that country. Um, Wherever it is, it's always like that. If you pick up any textbook in the US, you're going to see the US claiming that they've always been right in every battle that they've ever fought. So that's something to consider as well when you're taking into account the perspectives that you're going to be reading. Think about where the writer is coming from. There's certain social location, their identity factors that are making them who they are. They're going to have an impact on what they're writing, and they're going to have an impact on how they perceive the events that they're discussing. So have to keep that in mind as well. But these texts can also be used by those who are considered inferior to subvert the colonial power and bring down its power, which knowledge of the importance of the text can lead to a new text being used to be freeing colonies to portray themselves positively, to understand, critique, and overcome the legacies of the past. However, such a focus on a text is, when it's critiqued like this, is especially in academia, it's going to be a lot of Western intellectuals who have produced those texts and now also critiquing those texts. So post-colonial thinkers are still closely aligned to those who have produced the colonial texts that have enslaved any of the marginalized groups. So you also have to keep that in mind when you're thinking about the critiques that are brought up, that there's still going to be somewhere in there, and there's going to be prejudice that is encountered within that on either side, whether you're upholding it or you're critiquing it. So just keep that in mind as well. It didn't fit into the title, so I didn't put development in the title because it didn't have an isation or an ism. But development is also something that's very important to globalization. And development can be seen as a historical stage, usually between the 1940s to the 1970s. And that preceded the current global age that we're in right now. But development is sort of viewed as a quote unquote project that predated globalization in a way. And development was concerned with the economic development of specific nations. So when you think about the different nations that you'd be supporting economically, who don't have the quote unquote sufficient economic development, you'd think probably African countries. Anybody who's been termed a third world country would be one that was in the development stage in the 1940s to the 1970s. So you've got the global north trying to make it so that the global south becomes like the global north. And despite the attempt to do that, where they're creating a model off of what the global north looks like for development, it didn't really work. It failed in essence because the development project was an inherently elitist project for the nation states of the north, taking responsibility for the development of the nation states of the south, with the assumption that not only was the North better off economically and in every other facet of the world or of life compared to the South, but it also knew best how the South was supposed to develop. So it tended to help the South on the North's terms rather than taking the South's terms and leading the model that way. So the North was a predominant global ideal of economic growth, and that all other ways of growth were being considered inferior. So when we think about the different ways that the North has projected itself onto the global South, it's easy to see that we have a very ethnocentric view of Western culture being better than every other culture. And unfortunately, that's something that we still like to keep up quite a bit. But unfortunately, with the development project, it was motivated by Western powers trying to help the weak nations, but also the fear of communism. And we'll get into a little bit of that next week. But keep that in the back of your head that not only is it the economic systems that we're trying to manipulate by creating the development projects in the 40s to the 70s, but it's also political in nature as well. So again, not just an economic project, but a method of rule, said one scholar. And so you get into the Marshall Plan and Bretton Woods, which we'll talk about a little bit more next week and the week after. And they usually involve some kind of financial aid and sometimes like technological, military, food related. And that also led to food dependency within these nations. Um, and these poor nations are being mainly ignored in all of this. So they're not being asked what they need. They're not being asked what they want out of any kind of financial aid or food aid or military aid. It's just, we're going to come in, we're going to change things because it's got to be better this way because we are being successful this way. So that's another section of the way that colonial powers and Western nations have forced themselves onto other nations, trying to make them better in the ways that we think that they're better, or that they would be better that way. So there's been a couple of different theories that critique the development project. And so there's one that's dependency theory, and the other is world systems theory. Some of you might have heard about world systems theory in previous courses. Dependency theory is not as focused on, but so dependency theory is the development of nation states of the South and being contributed to a decline in their independence and an increase in their dependence on the North. So within this, underdevelopment is not, an aberrant condition or one caused by the less developed nations themselves, but it's rather been built into the development project and into global capitalism. And it involves the idea that instead of bringing economic improvement, development actually brings greater impoverishment. And one key work in that is Gunnar Frank's The Development of the Underdevelopment. Um, so his argue there is that behind the whole idea of development is that there's this notion that is underlying that the presence of less developed countries resembles, the present of the less developed countries resembles the past of the developed country. So when the developed country looks at the underdeveloped countries, quote unquote, it sees the poorness that it used to face. And so the less developed countries are simply supposed to follow the same path as the developed countries, and they'll become more developed. But if we think about the way that the developed countries got to be the point where they're developed when they were underdeveloped, you have to look at where they came from. How did they get there? They used imperialism and colonialism, and they sucked all of the resources and the power out of the land, out of the people that lived there. They were exploiting others to get to the point that they're at today. And if you go to the now underdeveloped countries, who are they supposed to exploit? They can't exploit themselves. They can't take on the resources like that themselves. So you're not really getting to the same path. There is no same path in that way because they can't exploit like that. So dependency theory was later kind of replaced by Wallerstein's world systems theory. And world system theory sees the world divided mainly between the core and the periphery. And of course, the core is more dependent on the periphery and getting exploited into so that the core nation can stay the core and is growing bigger and bigger while the periphery suffers. Um, so while development as a project had some successes, it failed since the world remains characterized by great inequalities between the North and the global South. And also, the development project came to be seen as somewhat offensive since it elevated the North, including its economic system, while demeaning everything associated with the South. So, globalization is a term used that sounds more equitable since it's characterized by multilateral and multi-directional movement. And although there's some evidence that the globalization project has not worked out much differently from the development project, there are other aspects of globalization that are not specific to exploitation, though there is quite a bit within it. So next we got Westernization. Westernization is the economic, political, and cultural influence of the West on the rest of the world. You could argue that it's somewhat consistent with globalization. However, the relationship to other processes is a one-way flow rather than globalization, which will have multiple flows. So within globalization, you have to think about the different multilateral ways that it's moving, all the different things are moving, whereas Westernization is the specific cultural influence of the West on the rest of the world. So it's just one direction. We're influencing someone in the East or the global South or anything like that. So uh, have to make sure that you're kind of differentiating it. But there's also Americanization, which we'll get into, which is kind of Westernization is kind of subsuming Americanization, but Americanization itself, based on the power that they have, is separate. So we got to talk about that as well. Um, Specifically, Westernization is closely tied to earlier periods of Western imperialism and colonialism, obviously. And claims of Westernization of the world are supported in various ways, but it's also important to recognize the differences within the West and the differences between the West and the other parts of the world, even those that seem to adopt Western ways. So, for example, political democracy is closely tied with the West, and the effort to democratize other parts of the world is linked to Westernization. Um, in particular, Ritzer and Dean come to the conclusion of Westernization efforts to democratize all of that. They come to that conclusion after providing a couple of examples about how we've exported democracy across all countries, and how it's not always a good thing to do that based on how previous military coups have occurred in governments such as Turkey and Istanbul. In other countries that have been influenced in Western democracy, especially with the US. We won't get into like all of the small details on that, but the nitty gritty way of the democracy working on a day to day basis is going to be wildly different from one part of the world to another. So there are other non Western areas of the world, such as China, who have had resisted democratization and have remained totalitarian in their form of political government. Um, so we have to think about the ways that, again, we've got this ethnocentric idea of what is supposed to be good for everyone, and that is being pushed onto other people. Not only that, but you've also got other types of exports like technology, language, laws, lifestyle, and food, that are being placed into um, different countries and kind of suggested that you should, take these out because they're better to use than what you've got in place, which is ignoring what the countries already have in place and what they've decided is best for them. So thinking about democracy still, we can think about the US, where there's a lot of empirical evidence that it shows that it's obviously highly dominated by wealthy elites. And examples like this have led some critics to question about what degree like that democracy has in the US and whether or not that democracy should be exported out through the world. And similarly, the market economies of the West are seeming to be like triumphant throughout pretty much all the non-Western world as well. But in ways, those are markets that are functioning uh, it's different for each geographic location. They're going to function differently across one geographical location to the other. And in the West, it's generally, the market is typically quite open and free, which is what we get the free market term from. But in other parts of the world where a market is more circumscribed, you have examples like China, where in the early 21st century, in some cases, it had an open market, but in others, the market was dominated by state run enterprises and controlled by the state. Um, so you have different economic factors as well that you have to think about, where if you put democracy into China, it might change the way that they're doing their economic setup as well. So these influences are not always going to be helpful in the way that the countries are functioning as well. So Westernization, you have to think about it both beyond political and economics as well, but to include like the technologies, the languages, and stuff like that. For example, global English is a product of Westernization. So places where English has one or more of the following roles are on these maps. So that's including the nation as an official language, as a language that has more than 50% of the general population who has fluency, um, the language of the government, higher education, commerce, and plural societies, and also it's English is just kind of an outpost dating from colonial times. Like we brought in English to Canada. Before that, it was going to be Indigenous languages that were spoken here. So you have to also consider the ways that Westernization has forced English onto everybody and saying that English is the best language to use, despite the fact that it's probably one of the worst to use. Pretty much the only reason that we're all using it is because we grew up with it. Um, so onto some critiques of Westernization. Now we see globalization as a more complex than just the one-way flow that's implied by global or Westernization. And instead, we have to think about Westernization as a process of mutual and probably uneven infiltration with the West permeating the rest, and vice versa. So there's also the critique of Westernization implying homogenization, that the rest of the world has to resemble the West. But globalization is supposed to be involving homogenization and heterogenization. So you got the same people and you got different people, and globalization is supposed to have both, whereas the West is just trying to make everybody all the same. And finally, the Westernization neglecting the circuits of culture that circumvent the West. So those primarily uh, serving through linking countries to the periphery to one another. So, for example, for Taiwan, the links with China and Japan may be far more important than those with the West. So, the growth of other power centers, such as the East and especially China, is going to lead to a view that there's not just one global cultural power, but plurality. Sorry, a plurality of them, and the West still stands out among them. But we also have to consider what other larger powers of the world are going to be imposing their own sides of living. So then we get into Easternization, which is the economic and cultural influences of the East on the West. And Easternization kind of shows that Westernization and Americanization are a little bit too narrow. So when you think about globalization equated to Westernization, and more specifically with Americanization, it's a very narrow view of globalization that ignores all sorts of processes like the role of regional powers in Japan, and increasingly China in East Asia. So while the process has to be discussed in the point of view within globalization, it's also important to point out that Easternization of the West has a lot more to do with the factors that are internal to the West than it does from the flows to the East. So it's very different from Westernization, which has more to do with the flows from the Western parts of the world. But the East is focusing on the different variations of influences that it imparts on the West as well. So in other words, Easternization is at least some degree another process that can be differentiated from, but also related to globalization. So these are all complex factors that aren't going to have just a single influence on each other. But some of the most um, obvious presentations that we see of Easternization on the West is the presence and popularity of various ethnic restaurants and cuisine in the West, like Chinese food, Thai food, Indian food, Japanese food, and their restaurants. A Zen look on life and various beliefs that come with that. So you've got reincarnation, for example. You also have vegetarianism. You have the impact of large Eastern manufacturers in the American market, such as different auto companies. So Toyota, Nissan, Honda, Hyundai, all of these are having a growing factor in the American market and Canadian market, I guess you could say North American market. Um, and these are all with the likelihood of growing to being quite massive, and more impactful than American made um, vehicles and whatnot. So, and then there's also electronics as well, like Sony, Panasonic, anything like that. So, manufacturing imports and everything like that as well are also something that you can think about. But Easternization can also extend into other areas. For example, there's some major health innovations that have come from under resourced areas of the East. So, for example, there was this eye surgery that was produced in India and Nepal by a couple of community ophthalmologists. They pioneered this new eye surgery to address blindness, and they developed it through a process of social entrepreneurship rather than for-profit model, which is championed throughout the West, especially in healthcare in the U.S. But the new procedure has transformed cataract surgery, how it's conducted. So you have to also think about the ways that you wouldn't just immediately assume that you would see these countries pop up. And I know that's sometimes hard, especially in North Bay, where there's not a lot of diversity in North Bay. Like we're pretty white overall. But if you go to Toronto, you see so many other cultures show up that you just don't see as much up in the north. And that's probably just the fact that we're so small. But you have to think about the other ways that you're not necessarily seeing the countries show up in different practices and different creation of just stuff, things in general, but also in practices like creating new eye surgeries or other healthcare things. We've got the vaccines that have been manufactured all over the world, developed all over the world. So different countries will have different impacts on others, and these can also spread to other countries. So this eye surgery, for example, ended up coming to the US and Australia and Finland, and of course Ritzer and Dean didn't list us in their example for this, but um, we can't just ignore the impact that the East has on the West as well, because we're not the only way to do things. And China also continues to explode as a global power, especially economically. And we can expect that that influence that the East has on us is going to grow. So it's going to kind of usher in a new and expanded form of Easternization. So China already has a very large reserve of Western currencies, especially the American dollar, as a result from the hugely positive balance of trade, far more exports than imports. And it kind of actually possesses the ability to grow exponentially in the coming years and to affect the West, not only in the way that it uses those reserves, like investing in the West or not, but also threatening to use those reserves in certain ways. So if China has so many dollars that it decides that it's going to go dump them out for other currencies like the euro, the value of the American dollar would go into free fall, and then after the American dollar goes into free fall, it's likely that the Canadian dollar will go into free fall. So China has a very large say over what goes on over here if it wants to, depending on what they want to do with the different items that they have, including the dollar. And obviously, money is quite important for the economy. Not only that, but it's also very influential with how different groups are being impacted based on funding. So onto Americanization. Americanization is the import by non-American products, images, technologies, practices, behaviors that are closely tied to America and Americans. So um, defining the concept can be kind of problematic because some equate it with globalization, as I said, with the West. You have to think about it not as a single flow. Sorry, globalization is not a single flow, it's multiple. Whereas Americanization is just straight on, just as Westernization is straight on, and the Easternization is straight on with us, taking on that influence. So, um, and as well, Americanization is not just the US, it's also the South, North, and Central Americas. And it's kind of amusing that Ritzer and Dean say that because as a Canadian, we want to sometimes distance ourselves from the US a lot of the time because we don't want to be associated with the influence that they can give. Of course, there's the classic Canadian, like, we're all polite, we're all nice, where the Americans are mean. So with that, you have to think about the fact that there's more than just the US when you're talking about Americanization. So as with Americanization, you've got the political, economic, cultural, etc. And so you have to be very clear that you're defining it, just as we had talked about within the first lecture about globalization. But I digress. Within the discourse of Americanization, um, it developed after World War II, and by the 1960s, the US had been seen as an industrial threat to Europe with academic literature supporting that as well. So there's a quote from one scholar who said 15 years from now, it's quite possible that the world's third greatest industrial power, just after the US and Russia, will not be Europe, but American industry in Europe. And so when you're thinking about that, it's also going to impact the ways that Americanization is creating this new reality that you're getting into. So if Americanization is a reality, sorry, I forgot about one other thing here. So you've got the decline of the industry being replaced with the threat that there's going to be US dominated consumerism. So Coca-Cola colonization, McDonaldization, Walmartization, spreading cathedrals of consumption, which is a reality in the Americas where you've got a lot of um, discussion about American imports and what is being imported. You have to specify, for example, because some might involve American invention, but also no longer manufacture. So if you think about the things that are being imported into the US from China, you're going to have a difference in what's actually being made in America versus what's being made in China. And so that is going to have a different impact culturally. It's going to have a different impact politically, economically. So there's sort of this nuanced analysis that is needed within this kind of discussion where you have to think about whether or not Americanization as a process is going to be as impactful as it is, stated up to be. Um, And so when you think about a nuanced analysis, you have to think about the different variations that the impact of Americanization has on the public. So, for example, there's much talk about Americanization in sport in a lot of places throughout the world. And with one example being commercialization and therefore Americanization of sports in New Zealand. So, on the global stage, you also have the Olympics that have been shaped by Americanization, or its subset, which is Californiization, which is specific to action sports like beach volleyball and snowboarding, who have become popular at the Olympics and were incubated in California and linked to promoting American visions and affluence. And so there's also the Disneyization of the European fairy tale, which was a lot more gruesome than it was in Disney. I don't know if any of you have heard about like German fairy tales and stuff like that. Go look them up. They're some of them are quite odd. Like I remember hearing about one where it was trying to tell kids not to play with fire, don't play with matches or something like that, and the kid ended up burning his house down or something like that and killing his whole family. Wild. Just so, and obviously that's my ethnocentric coming out because I had the Disneyization of the fairy tale. So everything's supposed to be fine at the end, but for this poor German kid, he killed his whole family. Um, so we also see that in McDonaldization, Walmartization, Starbuckization. Um, Again, lots of izations, but in essence, you see the elements of the US where it's becoming more um, common to have this commercialization of all of the different things where you've got these big box stores or big brand names like Starbucks that are now being placed everywhere in the world. So this is important because it has elements in common with Americanization, and you need kind of to look at it and see which of these processes are going on and in what ways are they similar, how do they differ, as well as how do they relate to Americanization. And at least some of these processes cannot be restricted to just America. So for example, McDonaldization has its roots in the bureaucratization and rationalization of German society and Max Weber's analysis of them. And so with all of them, at least to some degree, you kind of escaped from the roots of the US and they're now thriving elsewhere. So there are other ways of slicing and dicing the concept of Americanization. For example, in discussing Americanization, are we focusing on the impact on people's subconscious, on their bodies, the way that Americanization is embodied in those other societies? We could also deal with it in these different domains and many others. But Americanization would mean to very different things when you're applying them in different ways in all of those. So this, for example, is the different global response to Trump versus Obama. And so, with the rise of Donald Trump in the US and his America First policy, Americanization is also further complicated because the research is showing that the public image of the US around the world has declined under Trump, but people also around the world view Trump as, you know, adding in the arrogance, the intolerance, the dangerous with the widespread disagreement of his proposal, policies, proposal, all of that. And so, if Americanization is largely dependent on the countries who are receiving Americanization and their relationship with the US, then it's going to be suffering under the America First policy. And then the demand for Americanization can decrease. So, where you've got some options where it's going to increase and some where it's going to decrease and some where it's going to be taken on completely into another type of influence entirely, you have to think about the different ways that these exports are coming about. But in particular, you've also got a lot within consumer culture. So the reign of the market empire, what does that mean? So this is the great imperium, the United States, with the outlook of the great emporium. So essentially, this is the United States during the reign of the market empire that de Grazia is talking about. So it's an empire without frontiers. It arose during the 20th century. It's reached its pretty much peak during its second half, and it showed symptoms of disintegrating towards its close. So its most distant perimeters would be marketed by the insatiable ambitions of leading corporations for global markets, the vast sales territories charted by state agencies and private enterprise, and the far-flung influence of its business networks. And so the recognition of all of these brands and the intimate familiarity with the way of the American life, the American dream, that all of these kind of impact other people. They are forced into other people around the world. And its instruments are being derived from the same revolution in mass consumption that is more visible now in reshaping the lives of its own citizens. So in Degrassi's view, the exportation of America's innovations in the realm of mass consumer consumption has led to fostering consumer culture consumption practices across all other cultures. And so we see this in a more obvious exports like Coca-Cola, but also in more subtle phenomena like big brand goods and corporate advertising, where you're focusing very heavily on the same psychological tactics that marketing does in North America. And these are tactics that are stealthy, they're hard to decipher, and they're also easily fallen for, despite even the best efforts to avoid them. And so, for example, let's go on a tangent here. Think about when you're walking into a grocery store. You know, everybody's has to go grocery shopping at some point, whether or not you buy for yourself, buy for your whole family, or you just travel with other people when you're doing the shopping. But do you buy a single brand of an item, or do you fluctuate between brands, buying whichever is the best option that you think in the moment? Like, do you walk into a store and you look at the four options of salad dressings and pick out the one that you go for just because of the brand? Or do you buy it based on the price? Do you buy it based on what you think is the best health option in that moment that you're thinking about salad dressing? Like, what are you going for? Well, most people are going to be buying brands that they recognize, that they see are familiar with, that they're familiar with, because it gives them some kind of aspect of choice, but also comfort. You have a lot of choices in front of you, and all of this decision making that you have to do makes you uncomfortable. So when you walk into a store, you're more likely to pick up a brand that you've already bought before, that gives you some sort of comfort. And so what does that do? But it builds brand loyalty and brand allegiances that are built so deep that you don't even notice when you're actually going to make those decisions. So, for example, why do I buy no name products when I'm shopping at No Frills? Is it because it's the cheapest option? It's not always the case, but sometimes there's better sales on prices that have other brands. So, why do I actually buy the no name product? Is it because they're advertising a lot and screaming in your face how great they are? No, they're a little bit more subtle than that. They advertise by not advertising. So if you've never seen a no-name product advertisement before, it's nondescript. It has no other information other than the very basic brand name that they have, their yellow, black kind of setup. It's the same. It's pretty much never changed. And when they're advertising it, it is in your face exactly what the product is. So when they're advertising by not advertising, they're invading your brain by saying that they care more about the product that they're selling you than spending thousands of dollars of marketing the product to you to buy. So our product is going to be better than our competitors because we're not spending all that extra money trying to like market the product to you. It's already good enough. You're just going to pick it up because we're no name. And then they get to sale, at least from me. So then there's also brand loyalty, because when you start feeling obligated to buy that product from that brand, some people might think of your own brand loyalty. But if we stick with no name, my parents brought home no name products when I was a kid. So when I started shopping on my own, it was already something I was gravitating towards with those products. So I picked them up because I've been eating the same no name butter on my toast in the morning since I was 5 years old. So those attachments, that brand loyalty runs so deep that marketing executives know to start impacting how it is and what you're going to buy before you even get to the point of being in the store. They're already trying to sell it to you by the time that you're born. And I know that Ben Kelly has a class on consumer culture this semester. So I'll let him get into more of the nitty gritty of that. But that's something that Americanization has really brought in within, you know, imparting themselves on other cultures in essence. Um, so in trying to minimize the importance of Americanization, some researchers are focusing on the declining importance of the U.S. So Wallerstein has kind of a nuanced picture of the role of the US in the global world system, but that's dominated by images of decline now. So, beginning with the revolutionary events in the late 1960s, like the student uprising, the anti-Vietnam War movement, Wallerstein was describing the US as having a long term of decline that it had only been able to do in part based on the previous prosperity that it had. So he argued that, quote, the heyday of US prosperity is over, the scaffolding is being dismantled, end quote. So seems a little intense, but what he's arguing here is that much of the recent well-being of the US has been built on unusually low-priced imports, and that era is ending as a result of increasing tariffs and other economic trends that are going on. And although Wallerstein kind of wrongly focused on Japan and was unable to see the economic ascendance of China, there's still quite a bit of Americanized culture that is in decline here. So if America is retaining its military and political power, Wallerstein is actually seeing a terrible decline in psychologically among Americans, and they'll have a difficult time adjusting to their less high class, high superiority complex position in the world system. So it's not only going to be a decline on um, the U.S. as an important factor in the world, but it's also going to be in economic systems, and the Americans are going to have to adjust to that, and we're going to have to adjust to that because we're also kind of included in this. And although that the U.S. is, the big power, like Canada is still attached to them. If the Americans start going under, we start going under. So because of our relationship to them. That connection is something that is going to be very important to see going forward. So you also have to think about the other transnational flows and other units of analysis, like cities and scapes. And so with this, you have to think about the different ways that global cities are becoming more important than just countries. So, for example, New York is the financial capital of the world, but so is London, like London, England. Um, China has Beijing, Japan has Tokyo. All of these big cities are really being the ones that are upholding the rest of the country when you think about it in whichever aspect that you're doing it in. So, onto American anti-Americanization. Obviously, there's plenty of things that people don't like about the U.S. So whether that's militarism, gun obsession, death penalty, religiosity, lack of effort towards climate change, the imperialism, especially cultural, neoliberalism, the Washington Consensus, which is maintaining economic principles and fiscal policy conformation. Um, Although anti-Americanism is something that you can pick up on in pretty much any conversation about the US, it's become kind of a buzzword in political and academic circles. It, just like Americanization, is used by so many people and in so many different ways that it's kind of a vague concept that doesn't always have a lot of coherence attached to it. So it's necessary to realize that anti-Americanism is not just one homogenous phenomenon, but even if the word kind of conveys a sense of general criticism that is expressed based on the anti part of anti-Americanism, there's distinct forms, causes, and expressions of anti-Americanism. So we have to think about the anti-Americanisms rather than just one overarching anti-Americanism. So somewhat like globalization, there's more than just the one overarching factor that is globalization. There's economic, there's political, cultural, sport, health and medicine, science, all of those ones that were included within the first or second lecture there. So we had to consider those as well. So opposition to the US cultural, economic, and political policies, as well as like a sweeping negative generalization about the US, are included under the heading of anti-Americanism. And it can encompass everything from casual and superficial criticism of the US to a deep-seated and widely shared animosity to the list of dislikes that are listed there. So you have somewhat prejudice, but of course, this is being written by Americans. So you also have to take into account that they're probably just trying to uphold their own um, and defend the American because of deep seated nationalism. Um, we also have to think about the different ways that anti Americanism is a hit to Canadians. So think about that not only in the ways that you can say that the US is bad, but what are things that Canada is doing that would fit under anti Americanism? Where you've got these polarized views on different topics that are making it difficult for anybody to get anything done. And also the influence of Canada on other countries. We're less so than America in that we don't have that same kind of political power or influence or the media culture. Um, but you have to think about what things can Canada do that are also not favorably viewed by others. So we're not going to be kind of excluded here. Obviously, this is a map of unfavorable and favorable views of the US. So, in comparison to Obama, global views of Trump were more um, dramatic in how negative they were. So, even though the views of the US had stayed pretty favorable with some exceptions, the US was, for example, viewed more positively in Israel, the Philippines, Poland, South Korea, and most negatively in Russia, Turkey, and Mexico. You have differences here where you've got confidence in one president going way down, confidence in another president being quite high, but then also favorable views of the US changing, not necessarily because of Trump, not necessarily because of Obama, but also the policies that were being put in place. So it just kind of goes to show that there's different impacts of Americanization and anti-Americanization depending on location. So our view in Canada is going to be different from the UK's view. It's going to be different from Sweden's view. It's going to be different from Poland's view. It's going to be different from Turkey's view, Russia's view. All of these different countries are going to have different aspects of Americanization that they're going to be attacking specifically. Um, so just keep that in mind as well, that we've got only one view when you're thinking about your own experiences as well. So all right, so neoliberalism is pretty much the rest of this lecture. So it's it can be a complex topic, but again, don't get scared of it. It's something that you can break down into its basic principles and the roots and whatnot, and hopefully you'll be able to understand it a little bit easier. But we're going to start by talking about the importance of neoliberalism. So neoliberalism has arguably been probably the most important theory in the field of globalization studies. It has had profound influence on economics and politics in the US, as well as the rest of the world. So it has both people who are strongly upholding it, and then there's also huge critics. So with a lot of the um, 2007 to 2009 economic crisis being linked to neoliberal effort and belief in the free market and deregulation, critics have seemed to be getting the upper hand in the theory, if not in practice. And so it was the deregulation of the banks and financial institutions that led to a lot of high risk ventures like um, financial derivatives that had collapsed in 2007, leading to the subsequent global crisis, which is the Great Recession. I don't know how many of you remember it, but people also call it the housing bubble. Um, in essence, you have a lot of arguments that have been made and also heavily attacking and demonstrating that neoliberalism is quite disastrous and dangerous. However, the economy has regained some growth, and obviously, governments have returned to neoliberal business as usual, even despite the insane drop that it had in the global recession. So, even if governments are backing off from using its rhetoric, neoliberal practices have mostly been maintained. And so, therefore, you can't have globalization without talking about neoliberalism, and its problems kind of go hand in hand, especially on the economic and political side of it. So, it's a key factor, and it's not disappearing anytime soon, both with the emergence of the global age and the various problems that are associated with it. So, neoliberalism is a theory that has implications for globalization in general, as well as many of its elements as well. So, again, mostly applicable to economics and politics. Um, Economics being the market and trade, and politics being the nation state, and the need to limit its involvement in and control over the market and trade. And it's not only important in itself, but it also has strongly influenced other thinking and theorizing about politics and economics, especially within the various Marxian economic theories, um, such as Dave Harvey and other theorists that we'll talk about a little bit later. But if we go back to the roots of neoliberalism, again, this is something that you probably have touched on in previous sociology courses, but classical liberalism of the 17th and 18th centuries came about with John Locke, Adam Smith, the commitment to individual liberty. So neoliberalism is a combination of classical liberalism's commitment to individual liberty with the neoclassical elements of the economics, which are devoted to the free market, and the opposition to the state intervention in the free market. So liberalism was then termed neoliberalism after the developments of the Depression, being the 1930s. That depression era, I guess, of the 1930s. So in embedding liberalism, it was kind of a reaction to Keynesian's theories about interventionism. So it's embedded in the market in the 1930s because the market, entrepreneurs, corporations, all of those were inspired partly by Keynesian theory, which came out to be caught up in the web of political and social constraints, which were regulating the economics in ways that led to industrial strategy, transforming the need to counter the free market and collectivism thoughts. And so within that, you had a rise of key neoliberal thinkers. So Frederick Van Hayek, Milton Friedman, termed the Chicago Boys. These were economists that were devoted to liberal ideas, and they were alarmed by collectivist socialism, like the Soviet Union socialism, and intervention into the market by liberal governments like the Democrats in the US. And so in essence, the Chicago Boys had these unsuccessful experiments in Chile. So these were surrounded by the democratic election of their president, where's his name, Salvador Aldante, uh, as president of Chile in 1970. So the president was a Marxist essentially, and so in the U.S., especially within the CIA, they sponsored a coup of the military in Chile with CIA assistance. And in September of 1973, the president was killed in the coup, and he was replaced by the general who led it, and soon became president of Chile. So the new president of Chile took over and killed the previous one. So the Chicago Boys returned to Chile after being in Chicago, and with the new president's ascension to power, they were given the opportunity to implement Friedman's neoliberal ideas into the country. So that involved privatization of the industry, deregulation of the economy, and reductions in a nation's spending on social welfare problems. So within the political arena, you've got laws and regulations that were being dismantled, leaving people to deal with the shock of resulting lawlessness. You've also got actions associated with each of these that are profoundly shocking the economy as well as larger society as a whole. So the nation's capitalists were the main beneficiaries of this shock therapy, especially with the privatization, which put them in an ownership position and in control of the newly privatized industry. So they benefited from the deregulation of the economy, which left them free to operate and profit almost at will from all these people. So the main victims within the shock therapy were the nation's poorest, whose economic situation was made much worse by shredding all of the social safety nets that were protecting them, at least to some degree. So one of the main critics, Naomi Klein, calls this a shock doctrine. And this involved the view that within the total overhaul of an economy, it required a shock like the Chilean coup, and economic policies being put in place are designed to shock the economy in order to change it dramatically. And at least in theory, it's supposed to breathe life into it. But the basic free market premises of this economic doctrine were derived from Friedman's teachings and writings. So not only with that, but you've also got Reagan and Thatcher implementing and then spreading. So what that is the conservative political administrations of Margaret Thatcher in the Great Britain and Ronald Reagan in the US. Early on in their administrations, both leaders had undertook this shock therapy by taking on and defeating powerful labor unions. And these shocks were then used for a basis of radically overhauling the economies by applying the neoliberal ideas of the Chicago School and the Chicago Boys. So after a decade, we also saw the collapse of the Soviet Union, which left a few other alternatives than neoliberalism. So after the collapse of communism in Russia, Russia and other countries that were once in the orbit, like Poland, came in for shock therapy, and the institution, at least in part, became a free market economy. So that was also impacted by the key role of the Washington Consensus and the application of structural adjustment worldwide. So what that means is that because much of the world came to accept or was coerced into accepting neoliberalism, you saw these major forces that were like the International Monetary Fund or the IMF and the World Bank, both of which were heavily staffed by products of the Chicago economics departments and practice a form of shock therapy known as structural adjustment. So, in order to receive aid from these organizations, any of the nations that were receiving the financial aid, they had to restructure their economies and societies to be in line with the neoliberal theories. So, in addition to liberalizing the financial markets and deregulating the economy, this also meant a lot of major cuts to social spending and healthcare. And so, with this neoliberal theory becoming so huge and so large and associated with the US and the Washington-based global organizations that are exerting power and control, again, the IMF and the World Bank being prime examples, you have neoliberalism being kind of coined in turn with the Washington Consensus because of its linkage to the political and economic position of the US and the political location of the organizations being in the US. So the term Washington Consensus was coined by and is largely associated with John Williamson. Um, and most generally, the Washington Consensus is, quote, an unimpeded private market forces that were seen as the driving engines of growth. So they weren't really concerned with equity or redistribution, social issues, the environment, none of that. It all they cared about was having more money. So with that, you have a lot of power being associated with the economy, and the financial shocks came about in avalanches almost in developing other countries in the 80s and 90s. So, for example, you've got financial shocks in Mexico in 1994 and 1998. You had the financial crisis in Asia in 1997, 1998, the collapse of Argentina and its economy in 2001. You have scandals associated with Enron and WorldCom during this period that were linked to excessive application of the neoliberal ideas that were associated with deregulation and privatization. And you can look up those terms if you'd like, but they're not going to be too focused. They're just examples of what the examples are for neoliberalism here. Um, and on top of that, you've also got a variety of groups like workers, environmentalists, farmers, and those that are in poor and less developed nations that are coming together in opposition of the Washington Consensus. And there were actions in the alter globalization movements, especially in anti-World Trade Organization protests in Seattle, leftist governments throughout the Latin American countries that have directly challenged this model, and even more recently, you've also got Trump, who had kind of an ambiguous relationship to neoliberalism. On the one hand, he had a variety of regulations and social programs that were cut. And then on the other hand, he also imposed tariffs and other trade sanctions to like that neoliberals would be opposing because he was putting in different sanctions on trade and limiting the free market, so to speak. So it's a complicated process, and there are different aspects of it that are going to be important. But the basic principles of neoliberalism are all of these on the slide here. So you've got collectivism, state planning, and intervention opposed as discouraged risk, dominance of individualism, free markets vital for the long-term advantage of all, shock tactics to change economies drastically, commitment to deregulation and free trade, commitment to limited government with low tax, minimum welfare, privatization, and freedom from movement of capital, belief or claim that it's connected to a democratic political system, belief that all of the benefits will trickle down to all. And so, oh, I made myself a note. It was somewhat ironic, but as I was writing some notes down for this lecture, I was listening to a song called "Dead Inside" by Young Hunger, and its lyrics were pretty interesting. So try and connect that to neoliberalism, if you will, but you'd have to look it up to see. But really sticks to the neoliberal ideas there, especially in the chorus. So, anyways, I thought that was amusing. But getting on with it, the principles um, of neoliberalism, especially with the benefits that are trickling down for all, that are not restricted to the economy or politics, but can be applied to pretty much every sphere of society. So, Norberg, for example, said that my aim is not for economic transactions to supplant all other human relations. My aim is freedom and voluntary relations in all field. In the cultural arena, that means freedom of expression and of the press. In politics, it means democracy and the rule of law. In social life, it means the right to live according to my own values and choose one's own company. And the economy, it means capitalism and free market. So some people are going further to argue that these transactions occur in every sphere of life, and that they should be like that in the economy, where you've got the opportunity to be free in choosing what you'd like to do across all of them. Um, but the key to that, the key to neoliberalism, is that these transactions are within the individual. Neoliberalism is radically individualistic. There is not as much of a community care that there is to the individual. So there's a lot of belief in the need for the globalist capitalist system to continue to expand. And that's also presumed that this expansion is going to be bringing increased prosperity and decreased poverty, despite cutting all of the various social nets that are existing. So Friedman is a more recent author within neoliberal theory. He's a reporter and columnist in the New York Times. He's been there for nearly 4 decades, and he's got two main books. So he's got The Lexus and the Olive Tree, and The World is Flat, not to be like world earther related, but different with the way that he's explaining it. I'll go into why these books are important. So, in essence, you have in The Lexus and the Olive Tree, Friedman's basically trying to talk about the essence of globalization, with the tensions in globalization representing a car or a drive for improvement and prosperity. So the ancient olive tree, which forces roots and locates us in the world. So while the tree is anchoring us and locating us in the world, meaning it's keeping us within the local culture, we're using the Lexus to drive away from that to improve, become more prosperous, and all of the anonymous homogenizing, standardizing in the market is a threat to the local community culture of the olive tree. So he's arguing in a sense that you need to find a healthy balance that can be found between the tree that's keeping rooted us in the past and the car that's driving forward. And in his other book, he's arguing that the global playing field has been increasingly leveled. Um, this is his more influential book. And so the central point in the book is that the world is flat, meaning that there's no barriers and hurdles to compete successfully. And all of the barriers that were existing in the past have declined, if not completely disappeared. So, in essence, the global playing field has been leveled, making it more possible for more people to play, to compete, and to win within the neoliberal ideals. So this means that small companies and even individuals anywhere in the world have this unprecedented ability to successfully compete on a global basis. So while that's some way to think about it, because there have been advances, this is something that it's a really ideal way of thinking about how the world has shifted. Um, is there more opportunity, or is there more opportunity for certain individuals that have different identity factors? So if you think about intersectionalities that might impact how we're able to access these opportunities, who's able to seek out these opportunities, when are they able to seek out these opportunities? Are you at 18 able to have the same kind of market influence as somebody who's in their 60s and has been investing in the stock market for 50 plus years? Probably not. You're going to have differences in people's opportunities based on what they are doing in their lives, and also based on their intersectional identity factors. And this also differs from Ritzer and Dean's point throughout the text, which is also pointing to that the fact that some barriers are desirable and even needed to keep the flows going in the right direction. So if we return back to, for example, the airplane, you're going on a flight path for a reason. It's going to be the best for you. And if you didn't have the structures in place keeping that flow, there's going to be problems somewhere. So, not something that you have to get too into, but he's a good person to read if you're interested in neoliberalism as well. So there's two parts to critiquing neoliberalism, and I'll go through this as fast as I can. I know this has already been a longer lecture than everything else, but so there's Karl Polanyi, who is writing about 75 years ago. who stressed the role of the state in facilitating neoliberalism. So we didn't get to the individual being the most important without the state intervention. So these developed specifically within capitalism. And although this grew larger in previous eras as well, we're upholding that now. So neoliberalism is only possible because of the laissez-faire system that is developed due to state action. So if the laissez-faire system was left to itself, it threatened to destroy society. And so these threats and the real dangers in society that led to counter reactions by society and the state, like socialism or communism, are protecting themselves from the problems of a free market, especially within protection of products and those who labored within it. So with the expansion of the laissez-faire market and the reaction against it, it's actually called the double movement. So while economic liberalism saw counter reactions, such as any form of protectionism, as mistakes that disrupted the operation of the economic markets, Polanyi also saw them as necessary and desirable reactions to the evils of the free market. So basically, Polanyi thought that the idea of self-regulating the market was kind of absurd, and that collective social planning and the control was necessary, as these are the real things that produce what neoliberalism is trying to earn, which is freedom. So Polanyi saw um, a reversal in the tendency for economic systems to dominate society. So he said, within the nations, we are witnessing a development under which the economic system ceases to lay down the law to society and the primacy of society over the system is secured. So, in essence, you got a promise to end the evils produced by the dominance of the free market and also to produce more rather than less freedom in it. So, Polanyi's believed that collective planning and control would actually produce more freedom and more freedom for all than was ever going to be available in the neoliberal economic system. So, really, without powerful social political influences, we have to wonder where collective planning and social control over the market are coming from. Planning and control are more inadequate than ever in Ritzer and Dean's eyes. And beyond that, you have to start wondering whether the creation of a truly global planning and control is possible or even desirable. So, despite the fact that if Polanyi was alive, his logic would lead him to favor global planning and control because of his great fears over a free market. Um, it's so now more powerful and dangerous because it exists on a global scale rather than, at 75 years ago, it was a smaller scale within neoliberalism. So we've also got Naomi Klein. Um, we talked about this a little bit already, but the shock doctrine and dramatically changing or overhauling economies through privatization, deregulation, dismantling social welfare, which you can find in examples of Chile and Argentina. And it's actually seen to actually bring up further inequality and corruption and environmental disaster than what they were aiming for in the first place. So, among all of the different problems with neoliberalism is a theory that assumes that everyone in the world wants very narrow outcomes. So, for example, it assumes that everybody is desiring economic well-being, that is to be well off economically rather than to have basic needs met and then have a better social well-being, for example. So it assumes that everybody wants negative freedom, so to not have restrictions on restricting what you can do rather than positive freedom, which is the capacity to act on your own desires and interests. So there's a lot of cultural differences in the ways that well-being can be defined. So if, for example, yours is to have a stable livelihood, to have a stronger community rather than unrestrained competition, to have more social or legal leisure time to yourself so that you're not working 40 hours a week, and who cares how much money you have if you can play video games because that's something that you enjoy doing. And maybe that's something that you're more focused on instead of the neoliberal ideals of getting rich and being the best individual you can on the economic standpoint, and being free to do so however you want. So that freedom itself is also a complicated concept, that it includes political freedom, personal freedom, and neoliberalism often comes down from the north, from the US, or global organizations that are seeking to impose their definitions of what well-being looks like and what freedom looks like on other parts of the world. So there's variation on this among individuals who, in each of these societies, have their own definitions of what it looks like, but they're nonetheless imposed on them based on the neoliberal economies that are within their countries. So Um, anyway, so other theorists that have critiqued neoliberalism include James Ferguson, who talked about structural adjustment, in particular having devastating impacts on Africa. Economically, has resulted in a lot of inequality and marginalization, low and negative growth, and politically, it's brought a lot of decline of the state, lots of corruption, state failure. So you can read more about him if you want to get into critiquing on that. And then there's also Dave Harvey, who we talked about a little bit already, but neoliberalism has been central to globalization for him. And as an idea system, it's flowed around the world. So the major international organizations are founded on principles of neoliberalism, and it's spread the ideology. So the emergence of neoconservatism leads to neoliberalism being more overtly political, and it gives a lot of ability for authoritarianism to rise up. So an alternative is kind of now needed to counter this out. So Harvey talks about a number of different criticisms in neoliberalism, including the fact that it's produced and it continues to produce financial crises in various countries throughout the world, like Mexico and Argentina. It's helped to commodify virtually everything. If you've ever felt that you haven't been able to be productive at any point in time, that's something that neoliberalism has forced into you, because if you're not doing something that's productive for yourself, either through making yourself money or through upholding something else in your life, like if you feel like you can't just look at your phone for 5 minutes and then feel like you're not being productive, you're commodifying your own time as well. Anyways, it's also contributed to degrading nature and the environment. It's got economic dismissal, since it's being redistributing wealth in different ways that are just poor overall. Like it's not generating new wealth; it's just keeping the wealth in certain people's courts. And so Harvey calls this process capital accumulation by dispossession. Basically, when the wealth is transferred from the many to the few. And so this dispossession takes form in different ways locally. For example, with the neoliberal reforms in Mexico, those have promoted widespread privatization of land, and that's forced a lot of people off of their land. It's dispossessed them of their land. And so rather than being a form of subsistence for the farmer, the lands are being concentrated into large business interests. That are just increasing the wealth for a couple of people, but have not actually generated any real new wealth for anyone. And so it's just making it more problematic for them overall. There's also authoritative neoliberalism, which are mainly talking about the different claims that promote political freedom. And so, given that one of the claims of neoliberalism is that it promotes political freedom, it's kind of striking as a critique that neoliberalism actually tends to be more authoritarian. And this perspective towards authoritarian neoliberalism shows the coercive methods that are being used to support the concentration of wealth among the elite, whereas other various forms of governance are drawing from a multitude of ways in the getting the free market to shift and change and to be one and the same with political repression. So, in practice, neoliberalism really relies on the state practices that marginalize and criminalize oppositional forces. It uses judicial offices to limit how neoliberal policies can be challenged. It also protects the needs of capital, which curb protest and maintain a stable environment for businesses. And it places the needs of businesses over the wealthy, and the wealthy over everyday citizens. And what are we talking about here? But also COVID. So think about the ways that neoliberalism has exacerbated economic inequalities during the COVID-19 pandemic. Neoliberal policy has created more flexible policy within labor for the employer and not for the worker. It's also weakened workers' employment and decision making. It's added downward pressure on workers' wages. It's privatized healthcare in the US even further. It's reduced the state role in providing assistance to unemployed workers. It's got a lot of low wage workers and those who are outside of the labor market, who are not benefiting from anything at all. So when the pandemic began and it forced a lot of businesses to close, millions of workers lost their jobs, but they also had fewer protections to sustain themselves throughout something that has been economically an insanely difficult climate to live in. So consider how service workers' experience is different from professional workers. So, for example, working from home since March 2020 versus working in person since March 2020, if at all, due to the constant lockdowns, closures, and accessibility modifications that have been made. How many people are out of work yet again while restaurants are closed to indoor dining? What systems are in place to support these people who are not working? It's not the neoliberal ideas, considering that they don't want any social support for individuals. So we also see a lot of inequalities in working conditions where frontline workers in meat processing plants, grocery stores, fast food chains, they're required to return to work, but they're in risky conditions for their health. And I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir here, considering most of you who are working are probably not nodding along. Like, yeah, it's been shitty. Thanks for noticing about your cushy job while you're sitting there as a professor. So I get it. I'm sorry that a lot of you have probably lost wages due to the terrible situations that you're all in. And while I hope that a lot of us get better circumstances, nobody's ever going to be not on the bottom. And I get it. When the pandemic first started, I had to risk either getting, uh, without knowledge of anything related to COVID, no vaccines, no knowledge about what it was going to do long term. Um, I also had to risk getting my fiance severely ill as she's immunocompromised. So it was either going to work and getting paid so I could keep a roof over our heads, or risking her health. So it's difficult difficult in just the economic side, but it's also difficult for individuals as they work through what is the best option for them. And most of the time, neoliberal ideas are not going to try and support the individual, because they think that the individual is relatively able to do it themselves and keep themselves afloat. So um, some of the alternatives to neoliberalism as well, within critiques and whatnot. Some theorists have tried to present an alternative perspective, and especially during the wake of the Great Recession in 2008, 2009, 2007, whenever it started, um, people were calling for and predicting the end of neoliberalism at that point. So, despite the mounting critiques and resistance on neoliberalism, governments continue their neoliberal policies, like Obama's administration staffing its cabinet with neoliberal economists during the Great Recession, while Trump's administration had the imposed tariffs, as I said, and trade restrictions, which are counter to neoliberalism's primary principles. Um, but the other ways that you can think about globalization as well, are the ultra globalization movements that have been growing within the realities of neoliberalism, and becoming even more apparent, because as neoliberalism is supportive of capitalism, a lot of the critiques and alternatives have been developed by neo-Marxists. And two of those are the transnationalist capitalist class, and the precariat. So again, you're probably going to recognize a lot of these just from other discussions. So, what is the transnationalist capital class? But it is a neoliberal capitalist globalization in its current form. So, Sclair in 2002 argued that there's two systems of globalization. There's the neoliberal, which is the current form, but there's also a socialist system of globalization, which is possible and is necessary due to the extreme class polarization and the ecological unsustainability in capitalism. So while that's not in existence just yet, what is being suggested here is that there is some foreshadowing going on with the ultra globalization movements, which are more heavily focused on human rights and sustaining the environment. So while the nation state remains important, Sclair is also making the case that it's focusing on more on transnational practices that are able to cut across the boundaries, including those that are created by nation states, and the implication that territorial boundaries are somewhat declining in the importance of the capitalist globalization. So, what does that mean overall? Um, you get into transnational practices. So, as a Marxist, Sclair is prioritizing economic transnational practices. And it's in this context that you have a central aspect of the analysis, which is the transnational corporations, which are predominant in this situation. So, underlying this is that this idea that capitalism has moved away from being an international system into a globalizing system, and that is decoupled from any specific geographic territory or nation state. You've also got transnational practice of great importance with politics, and you have the transnational capitalist class that predominates there as well. So it's not made up of capitalists in the tradition Marxian sense of the term, but rather they don't necessarily own the means of production as Marx had produced it and discussed it, but rather they have four separate fractions. So Sclair had these fractions of the transnationalist collapse. So the first one is the uh, corporate fraction, and that's made up of executives of transnational corporations and their local affiliates. Second, you have the state fraction, composed of globalizing state and interstate bureaucrats and politicians. You have the third, which is the technical fraction, which is made up of globalizing professionals. And finally, you have the consumerist fraction that's encompassing merchants and media executives. So these four fractions are very different from the capitalists conceptualized by Marx, but they suggest that these are the members that actually share the local and global interests, and they're the ones that are exerting power and control across entire nations through cultural and political control. They have all of the global perspectives on the wide range of issues, and they come from all over the world while they're sharing similar lifestyles. So what we really need to understand here is that the transnational social practices and dominant institutions are really vital for exposing the problems for potential change, like human rights movements and other altered globalization movements. So, as a Marxist, Sclair isn't only interested in critically analyzing capitalist globalization, but rather in articulating an alternative to it and its abuses. So, he sees some promising signs in the protectionism. Um, which is like the social safety nets types of things. Some of the countries that see themselves as being exploited by transnational corporations are also looking at that kind of stuff, where they're like, "Hey, that's not something that we want anymore." And there are also hopefully new social movements such as the Green Movement, which are seeking more sustainable environment, and the various altered globalization groups that have sprung up in recent years. So he's interested in the various human rights movements, which he believes are the seeds to the alternative neoliberal capitalist globalization, which is socialist globalization. So Sclair predicts that these and other social movements are going to be gaining momentum within the 21st century as they increasingly resist the ways that globalization have been appropriated by transnational corporations. So, within Marxian dialectical terms, he sees that the success of capitalist globalization is sowing the seeds of its own destruction. So, that is that its expansion tends to provide the opponents with the resources, the organizational forms, and obviously the clarity of their purpose, and that transnational corporations are growing more successfully, and so do their abuses. And so we need to supplant them from being the central players in the global system. So, for example, here's the top 25 billionaires who are working to promote their class interests. And you can see that there's very few people in the world that are holding all of that power in the transnational capitalist class. So while the wealthy individuals are spread around the globe, but they're still predominantly concentrated within the U.S., which means that's where their power is going to be. So, what's their aim in globalization is something that you should think about with this. What is the purpose of the 25 billionaires that are on this world map? What are they thinking about when they're working to further neoliberalism? And then there's also the precariat, which is the other form. So the other group that's fighting against neoliberal policies is the precariat. And who is that? But the people that are working in the growing number of part-time workers, temporary workers, or are otherwise living precariously without stable jobs, occupational identities, or any other social protection. So these temporary jobs are becoming more and more common, especially among the gig economy with Uber, Skip the Dishes, Uber Eats, and all the different digital tasking platforms that offer individual tasks to people to complete for their money, none of which are regulated because you become a freelancer or an independent contractor. But it also includes other jobs as well. So, for example, this course is being taught by a part time instructor compared to the rest of the courses that are taught by full time professors that are in the sociology and anthropology department. They have, most of them at least, have tenure. So they're, sticking with it and they don't have to worry too much about their job security. They know that regardless of what the university is doing next semester, they're likely to still have their job. But remember when I said earlier that I'm sure I know what you're all going through, and it's like, yeah, sure, whatever, dude. Like, you don't know the struggles of a student's chilling here making minimum wage. And so I get it. I got three jobs, all of which have an end date. I could be making minimum wage in 6 months with the rest of you if nobody wants to keep me around, because nobody is keeping me for more than part time. So while I'm getting paid not terribly right now, all three of these jobs are temporary. So, like, there might be another temporary job out there that I can get lined up afterwards, but you have to think about all the other jobs in the world that are being impacted by being precarious. So you can get another job lined up and you can try and find something else, but that takes time and energy, which is hard to come by when you end up juggling a lot of smaller jobs at once. So again, I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir, but you're not alone in this, and it's happening everywhere. And the number of triple secure jobs, or jobs where you have full-time work, that's not going anywhere, and that you have benefits at the job. Benefits? What? Who has that in work right now? I have never had job benefits in the entire time that I've been working, since shuffling through retail and other now office related jobs. Like, never have had benefits. So pension, healthcare, insurance, like all of that is decreasing so quickly because nobody wants to pay for that anymore. It's easier to have part-time workers. It's easier to all of the business owners to keep it so that they don't have to pay out for these things, because then they make more money, they make more profit. If you have a group of people who are working at a grocery store. Take, for example, Sobeys. I used to work at Sobeys. The only people that were making any decent money or had any access to any care were the 6 people in the entire grocery store that worked full time. Everybody else, part time. They had over 150 employees, and only 6 people in the entire store were able to access full time hours. They were the only people that were able to actually access any kind of health benefits from the employer, because if you didn't work more than 30 hours, they didn't have to pay out for you. So it saves them money, and it also screws the workers over. So, is there a possibility of change? Of course, there's some um, experiences that you can talk about that are in common with everybody else that's in precarious work. And taskers are kind of sharing the common experience, and we're creating kind of a quote unquote class in the making, with the potential that we could unite against the system. So, if we're all sick of working like dogs to stay alive out there without getting any benefits, any security in our work, we could eventually get a revolution going, whether that's literally, or everybody just decides we're not going to work anymore, or overthrowing the rich, I guess, whatever that looks like. Um, so critics are arguing that the divisions across workers are making it hard to organize into a revolutionary type performance that would actually change the current system. So, for example, if the Uber Eats driver and the Skip drivers are standing in McDonald's, both waiting for an order, they're really fighting for the deliveries. Even Skip versus Skip drivers, you've got this inherent competition that you have to try and buy for work against others, which is not constituting a united front. And then you think about that across all of the precarious work sectors, whether or not you're in retail, whether you're in groceries or in fast food or the restaurant business or in other part-time work opportunities. So you have to think about the way that we're battling each other just to survive. And then you go back to these people who are really living at large because they don't have to worry about anything like that. And they're all making that money off of the backs of everybody that's down in this section. So while we're constantly battling each other, we're not looking up and being like, well, who's running the ship? Who's the one driving the car? Like, why can't we get to them? So we also have to think about the ways that other people are trying to survive in this world and make a decent living. But we also have to think about the ways that we're battling each other while trying to get to that point of the neoliberal, the best neoliberal. And I guess you could think about that as sort of the grass is always greener on the other side. And once you can get to through the American dream and make a living and make millions and be rich, like, you'll be golden. Nothing else will be bad. But that's not necessarily the case. So while that's kind of dark, I guess, hopefully everybody is all right out there, at least right now. But this is something that we're going to see a lot more in the coming years, where we end up having a lot of these battles against others in the gig economy, where you've got, like, for example, Uber and cab companies and whatnot. They're battling it out, trying to get people to use the cabs, um, because it's cheaper to go with Uber than it is for the cab company. And so you pick that over one or the other. And there's also more um, ease of access with using everything on your phones and being able to order everything and have it come to you without any issue. Um, there was a really good, I'm going to plug StatCan right now, but if anybody's interested, there was a really good podcast on this from Asayers, like Asayers, that StatCan has recently put out to try and reach more people with all of this. But there was a really good podcast on that. So if anybody's interested, shoot me an email and ask about the Asayers podcast, and I'll send it to you. But I'll finish up rambling for the day. So the summary here: relationships between processes are complex and interrelated. Some of them have disappeared, some are overlapping, some are declining. And are we in an era of posts, or is that even possible? All of them have some relevance to globalization, but globalization is not nation state based, and it does not involve direct military control. It's multi-directional. So you have to think about that when you're thinking about the flows of all of the other isms and izations. And then on neoliberalism, it's central to the development of the current form of globalization, obviously. Um, Ideology has been spread, and the policies of international institutions have a key role. Many critiques have been developed with examples of its failures mounting. The current global crisis is being fueled by both the efforts to develop alternatives and also call for change, but also issues involving change are complex, and they impact neoliberalism on globalization will be long term. It's not something that we're going to see disappear very quickly. So, due next week is the first discussion question that's due Monday, January 31st at midnight on Blackboard. So make sure that you're reviewing the requirements for the question in the assignment tab. And if you have any questions, feel free to email me. Yeah, so I'll leave it here. Thanks everybody for listening and sticking through it. Next week's lecture should have less slides, but who knows, maybe I'll ramble on just as long. So hope you all enjoy your week, your day, your evening, your morning, whatever time you're listening to this. And I'll talk to you another time.